And Tim, it's great to have you here with us today, and welcome. You can go ahead and share your screen.
Great, thank you. So welcome everyone. Thank you to Heather and Mary Kay and Missio Nexus. I am really excited about this topic. Some of you might not know, but I had a really great time to talk about writing for social change at the recent Evangelical Press Convention and had just really tremendous feedback from the attendees there. So this becomes a important topic for us because writing for social change not only touches journalism, but it has to do with how we're crafting communication messages. So one of the key things that I when I'm talking particularly with journalists, I say that journalism and journalists are as a profession should be moving toward a new model that I describe as writing for social change. Now, it's not advocacy journalism, and it's not driven by some single agenda. We see that out all the time, but it's really like a collection of certain ideas that I want to introduce you to. It's really kind of a state of mind, and about the core purpose of journalism. And as I've really thought through in my own career, talking with many journalists, working as an editor as well as a writer and journalist, the concept of positive social change keeps kind of migrating to the top as a good way for us to understand what is journalism attempting to accomplish. So let me advance the slide. I don't use the word progressivism because honestly, it's kind of tainted by the historic progressive era in American history. There are triumphs and failures Americans experienced through those years. So we think of if you were an American citizen involved in the temperance movement at the turn of the 20th century, the prohibition of the sale of alcohol would have been just like your dream come true. But what happened, of course, is that unleashed a huge amount of ferment in society, no pun intended, but that eventually was repealed. So we come to realize that historic era is not just about changing the law or changing constitutions. So sometimes moving forward or making progress really doesn't work. Progress shouldn't be viewed the same as positive social change because sometimes it comes with a lot of agendas and baggage. Sometimes that road less traveled that we talk about might mean shifting into reverse. I want to give you two real quick examples. Some of you might know that in the state of Oregon a few years back, it became the very first state to decriminalize hard drugs. And this new law was heralded as a progressive triumph and it steered tax revenue from legal pot sales into addiction rehab programs. But a few years later, what do we find out? Instead of a decline in addiction, Oregon recently was ranked as the state with the highest rate of illicit drug addiction. That wasn't part of the planning. That wasn't what they were going for. Another illustration would be just look at the way young adults are discovering pop music of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It played on an LP at 33 RPM. They're participating in social media fasts and putting black and white film into their SLR cameras, probably handed down from their parents or grandparents. Would you believe me if I told you that the sales of vinyl recordings have increased annually for the past 17 years in a row? Yeah, so it's important for us to realize that positive social change could be pulling something from the past. It's not always about quote unquote progress. So this really isn't about nostalgia, but rather our longing. We have this deep longing for intimate, authentic relationships, being accessible, being non-digital. so many of college students today that I work with all the time, they're digital natives. But they crave that one-on-one contact. So what if we as journalists and storytellers endorse the greater purpose of positive social change? What would happen? What would happen to ourselves in society? So ask ourselves this question: are we seeking dominance, control, financial gain, celebrity, maybe a book contract, or what my kids always wanted, that golden ticket from Willy Wonka? We have to identify really what is it that we're going for. But isn't our purpose as writers and editors and journalists and people doing communication and marketing to assist others to learn from the mistakes and successes of the people that we write about and report about? It's true that we narrate the stories of saintly sinners and sinning saints, and that's a step in the right direction. But we want to give people the ability to make well-informed choices that should deeply motivate our journalism. But I've come to realize that being informed is a necessary thing, but not always sufficient. It doesn't always lead to the kind of change we're going for. I could fill a very long and tragic and sad book with examples of leaders who were really well informed, but still made the wrong choice. They had all the information they needed, but they still behaved badly. So some of you might know the legendary historian Barbara Tuchman. She wrote an amazing book, March of Folly, back in 1978. And it narrates how well-informed leaders deceive themselves and the public as human lives were needlessly lost. So our understanding of the media's effect on social change is still emerging. And there's so many good examples that we can point to. So we have many of the appropriate questions, but the complete answers of how social change happens is kind of elusive. So one of the questions I've asked myself many, many times, really, which comes first, the chicken or the egg or the omelet? By what means does media strengthen or inhibit change in public opinion and activism? But why do we want social change? And so who should the media praise or blame, and exactly why? So before we dive more deeply into writing for social change, I want to pause and consider the reality that no journalists, no marketers, no communicators working right now have ever faced the kinds of challenges that we're facing that exist during this current year. So I wanted to enumerate what I call the big five. Yeah, that's a nice, if you've been to Africa, you know what the big five is in terms of the animals you're supposed to see on safari. But this is the big five challenges that we're facing as communicators. So one of those is, the first one would be what I call accelerated technology-driven change. Because successful technologies such as cell phone networks and smartphones, they're scalable, they're transferable, and available globally 24/7. This kind of change has resulted in about 1.5 billion smartphones are being sold each year. So I often will ask my students how many, show of hands on the number of you who have only owned a smartphone. So if you look at the history of smartphones are relatively new, but they've completely captured the market. But now we're dealing with artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, but that's not the end of the road for tech-driven change. The second one is what I call infotoxification. This word is defined as the difficulty or the impossibility of making a decision or keeping informed about a particular subject due to this endless stream of data or content that exists on the web. And so, of course, with the web today, we're getting not only stuff that's ending up in our email box, but we're getting notifications, and the experience that people have of information overload is almost like a constant state of, it's almost like at a toxic level. So number three is what I call hyperreality. So this is a new term to many people, but it actually is coming out of the academic community and scholars. So this idea has been in existence since 1991, when a really famous sociologist, Jean Baudrillard, coined the term in one of his books. So one person defined hyperreality as an image or simulation or aggregate of images and simulations that distorts the reality it purposes to depict, or does not in fact depict anything with a real existence at all, but which nonetheless comes to constitute reality. So think of just the blockbuster hit Barbie. That's a great example of how this hyper reality still has influence on us, even though Barbie is a fictional character, even though you can go and buy the toy Barbie. We're using digital technology to reinterpret Barbie, and that's a great example of this hyper reality. So Forbes magazine, for example, describes hyper reality as a state where physical and virtual worlds merge together. We can no longer distinguish between the two realities. But more importantly, this distinction wouldn't matter because people derive equal meaning and value from the simulated world. So one little example of this is that there's a beauty filter on TikTok. So this hyper reality is something that we experience every day, but we're kind of unaware of it. But people who are skillful at using hyper reality can get their messages across to us very powerfully, and millions of people are unaware of really what's happening. So number four is perpetual anxiety and depression. These are two hugely worrisome mental health concerns. In fact, on my way over here, I was visiting with a friend, and he was talking about his daughter, who is, I think she's probably 26 years old, and she's dealing with some really worrisome, it's like a perpetual state of anxiety. And I see that in the classroom as well, and in their parents. So we often respond by going to our doctor and getting medication. So right now, I dug up the numbers on this. Experts believe that about 37 million Americans are taking antidepressants, and an estimated 25 million take anti-anxiety medications. And not too long ago, the U.S. Surgeon General issued this devastating assessment of the brutal effects of social media on teens. I would have to say, why wasn't that done 10 years ago? The fifth point would be mediated violence. So this daily exposure we have to violence at all levels of society and culture, with the most of this exposure coming through the media. So for example, when I woke up this morning, there was more reports of devastating losses in the war in Ukraine, when a missile from Russia came over and killed 30 people. Since it's constant, we're constantly being exposed to this mediated violence. So what do I mean by mediated violence? So if you witness somebody being injured in a violent act, that's not mediated. You're perceiving it with your own senses. You're drawn into, what can I do to help that person? Just this past weekend, there was a pedestrian who got hit by a car in our neighborhood, and the police and fire were right there. It was literally right outside my front door, and so that's different. That's not mediated. But when we're seeing mediated violence, it's online, it's on the radio, it's on television, it's on our mobile phones, it's on text messaging. This has a huge influence of how we understand our response to violence. So it's also in entertainment and advertising. We're exposing a global audience of all ages to mediated violence. we really have no idea how this is all going to have an aggregate effect on people. Let's move on to our next section. So one of the key understandings for writing for social change is really how we understand what constitutes communication. So how do we define it? How do we understand what really goes on when people communicate? If we don't have this functional definition, we're really not going to accomplish the purpose of our communication. So in the course of my study and teaching of this, I really have a definition that a scholar I know personally came up with, and that I think is great. So communication is sending a message that elicits a response. So the biggest thing to get in your mind is that unless there's a response, no communication is taking place. And this is precisely where communicators today, the news media, anybody doing advertising, marketing, communications, anything like that, we find ourselves in this situation. Millions of people are listening, millions of people are watching. That's often the limit of their response. That's all we're getting out of them. And sometimes if they're listening and watching, it's while there's 2 or 3 other things going on. They're cooking dinner or talking to somebody, or they're in their car. So where our capacity for the audience to respond has really been handicapped by some of all these other factors. So this definition of communication actually gives us this truly terrifying dilemma that we face. Many of our friends and family, they're in this state of high anxiety, made worse by mediated violence they're exposed to, online, TV, radio, chat rooms, streaming services. They have lost the ability to respond. So no true communication has occurred. Can we admit to seeing this? Can we kind of acknowledge that this has been a huge problem? Our continual exposure to violence has stunted our ability and our capacity to respond. The national non-response to school shootings is one example. How many times, even in since January 1st of this year, it's like, oh, another school shooting. Oh, another shooting in the mall. Another shooting, random violence where people, even the police are killing people that using way too much force than really necessary. And we don't respond. We don't know what to do. So one thing that I really encourage people to be learning more about is really doing a deep dive into seeing how both our media and our society and our culture are functioning together to have a big influence over what people think, what they say, and what they do, like almost every day. So I want to introduce you to some communications theories. These are things that scholars have sometimes spent 20 or 30 or more years developing that really help us comprehend exactly how we're going to think differently, write differently, and what is it that we're trying to get from our audience when we're communicating. So I want to reference 4 different theories that I think are particularly relevant. So understanding immediate media effects and how people are interacting with media. So the first one is called uses and gratifications. And in this theory, instead of asking, what does media do to people, the theorist kind of flips the question around and asks, what do people do with the media? So back when I was working for a daily newspaper and before the internet, quite a few years ago, my editors would joke and pressure the writers to meet their deadlines. And they would always kind of joke with the staff and say, what you are writing there, you may think of being golden prose, but tomorrow it's going to be underneath somebody's bird cage. And that means to us that people often forget, and even after they've responded to a piece of communication, think of a sermon. So I was in church this past Sunday, and we went to adult education afterwards, and the pastor said, "Oh, do you remember what we talked about last week in my sermon?" Well, no one had any memory at all. It was just 7 days ago. So in this theory, we try to make sense of the fact that people are constantly assuming these media messages for all sorts of reasons. And the other thing to realize is that you can take one particular kind of message, and the effect on each individual is going to be different. So when we put out a message like, "Hey, get your flu shot," almost everybody is going to react in a slightly different way. And this makes our challenge all the more difficult in terms of what is it that we are trying to communicate? What is the message that we're trying to get from point A to point B? And what is it that we're trying to influence in terms of their behavior? So when we begin to understand how people use media, what people do with the media, it helps us comprehend how to better craft our messages. Okay, so the next theory is called the cultural studies theory. So there's quite a well-known theorist by the name of Stuart Hall, and one of his big ideas was that the mass media, that would include TV, the major TV stations, news broadcasts that reach tens of millions of people, they have an effect of maintaining the dominance of the powerful and exploit the poor and the powerless. So this theory is pretty controversial because when you think through the way mass market media functions, is also closely allied with either political messages or marketing messages or actually advertising messages. So this system that's been set up in the mass media, this particular theorist Hall critiques heavily because the mass media participates in the system that disempowers people. So researchers sometimes will present their work as pure science with no presuppositions, but every media theory by its very nature has an ideological content and construct. So this particular cultural studies theory comes out of a number of different directions, but it specifically develops the way ideology influences the mental frameworks, the language, the concepts, the categories, the imagery of thought, and the representation, and finds that different classes and social groups deploy these ideologies to make sense and to figure out and render the way society works. So one of the big concepts for our American society is our devotion to the capital and market kind of economy, where there's free trade, where there's people can participate, they can buy and sell and exchange goods, that people can accumulate wealth, people can take care of themselves, versus in more controlled societies, whether it's Russia or North Korea or Cuba, where every individual is kind of seen as like a creature of the state, and the state displaces individual rights. So most of us are kind of unaware of a lot of these ideologies and the tremendous impact they can have on our lives. So under this theory, the mainstream mass communication and the press ignores the power struggle and they actually are engaged in masking the media effect of it by the way they participate. So for example, one clear instance of this is this attention to economic growth. So we find that the media is trying to always gauge how is the economy responding? Are people getting jobs? Can they pay the rent? Can they go and buy houses? But see how there's an underlying ideology about the way the economy is supposed to work. All right, let's move on to the next one. The third one is called cultivation theory. Because TV contains so much violence, the researchers found people who spend the most time watching television, they just develop this exaggerated belief that the world is mean and scary. So the violence they see on the screen can cultivate this social paranoia that counters this ideas that people can be trustworthy, and that the surroundings in our neighborhood are safe. So TV's power comes from the symbolic content of the shows that they're watching, we're binging and rewatching. So as somebody who is drawing examples from the media all the time, I at least once or twice a week, I'll go on to like Netflix to see what are the top 10 shows that people are watching. And one of the kind of shows that like constantly is percolating to the top is the true crime narrative. Like almost every couple of weeks, there's some new limited series on Netflix or on Apple TV or these other streaming services, or on even traditional television. It's like this true crime narrative. So people who watch these shows, the researchers and the theorists have found they have this exaggerated belief that the world is mean and scary. But what does that mean for us in terms of how we're communicating? So this perception about violence, it influences viewers' beliefs around them and the feelings that they have connected to those beliefs. So they have classic one would be, think of a suburban family driving into a major metropolitan area. I happen to be in the Chicago area right now, but like, oh, we're going to go into Chicago. Oh, well, make sure you don't go into certain neighborhoods. Make sure you stay near the Loop area where there are all the theaters, and you're less likely to be exposed to violence. So that's an example of how we have this belief that the world is mean and scary. Now, there is bad stuff that goes on, but if we're constantly exposed to this media violence, it's exaggerated beyond what it should be. So even if you avoid violent shows on Netflix or these other streaming services, excuse me, doesn't mean that you're immune, that you're completely free from these effects of cultivation, because they enter into the everyday conversations. So the fourth one would be what's known as the agenda setting theory. Some of you might know something about this because it comes up particularly during campaign seasons when politicians are saying, well, you know, the media is always like spinning the message, and they're setting their own agenda. So that's why over the last 10 years, so much of political campaigns have been migrating into social media, where they feel like they can get a quote unquote unfiltered message. Well, what do you do if they're lying on their unfiltered message? That's why we really count on journalism and journalists to step in and really try to ferret out the truth. So in agenda setting theory, one of the key things for us to grapple with as communicators is that the average person can only focus on 5 issues at any one time. So if we're talking about immigration and ongoing controversy about abortion, and you know what's going on in the House of Representatives, and overdose of street drugs and fentanyl, then for example the war in Ukraine or the situation in the Middle East, what happens is that in agenda setting theory, we discover that the time and mental energy that people have to think about these issues is scarce. And that's a very sobering reality for somebody like myself, who spent most of my career in trying to communicate important news stuff. So it's today even more in the context, there are all these other things attempting to grab that 10 or 20% of a person's immediate attention and get a message across to them. So when we're thinking about writing for social change, one of the key things I have for you, this is really an important takeaway, is you have to discipline yourself to focus on one or two or possibly three things that are most important to you, is almost like your personal agenda. So I know some of the people who are the most successful individuals writing for social change, they're often just writing about like the one big issue that they are most concerned about. And it is especially important to them for whatever reason. So when we're thinking about trying to craft use media, craft messages, and communicate with people, we have to do it in a much more organic way than we might have been able to communicate to people 20, maybe 30, maybe even like 10 years ago. People are connecting to messages that come with this level that you feel like the messenger has something at stake. He's not just like delivering the newspaper. He's just not like delivering the telegraph or sending off an email. All right. So one of the realities when we're working with on some of these issues is that there is kind of what I call a public agenda. There are sets of issues that are most clear in people's minds. So again, I keep referring back to some of these issues that have been kicking around that are still important and relevant today. But maybe you caught the headline that President Biden has reversed course on the wall along the southern border, and he's going to now build additional sections of this wall because the immigration problem has become so difficult and so problematic. So one of the important concerns when we're thinking through the messages that we're trying to get across is how do they sync with the public agenda and what we're seeing in the media, right? So, of course, we see stories such as events in Israel or the Ukraine or events in Washington. That's always going to get a lot of attention. So we need to figure out how we're going to link into that public agenda or a media agenda, or we're trying to do something that's very contrarian. So there are lots of examples of how either alternate messages or contrarian style messages have been able to navigate their way through the public agenda to come to the public's attention, and they'll do something. So there are lots of examples of that. So the reality that we have to accept is that media still has this huge power to the way that we shape reality. And when we think through how the agenda setting function operates in our society today, it's constantly changing. But there are certain repeated topics that keep emerging. And so one of those, of course, has to do with the rights of individuals. For example, the right to immigrate, the right to healthcare, the right to vote. Those are issues that kind of cycle back up into the news all the time. So when we think through writing for social change, we have to consider, well, what are people thinking about? What's on their mind? How can I either integrate my message that picks up on what's in the public agenda, or we have such a compelling message that it will displace something that's in the public's mind and bring some new thinking and hopefully some new energy toward making some change. So let's move on to the next slide. Actually, I'm a little bit behind here. So, okay, so this is my next slide. So I don't have a punch list or like a recipe, a foolproof recipe for writing for social change. But I do really enjoy and find it so helpful to look at historical and contemporary examples that were really successful and impactful for facilitating social change. So no surprise, Uncle Tom's Cabin is probably one of the most important examples. And this, of course, it came out in 1852. This is almost 10 years before the start of the Civil War. And the fascinating thing is that Harriet Beecher Stowe, when she was developing this novelized treatment, it's first of all started off as a magazine serial, but then she did a tremendous amount of research. She interviewed people, and she really did her homework. And of course, this issue to abolish slavery was deeply personal to her. She had a very strong passion, and she was committed to the cause. And as a result, we see that this novel had a profound impact on public opinion, helped really build support in the public's mind for abolition. And in the 1850s, believe it or not, this one book sold more copies than any other book other than the Bible. So the Bible was number one, and number two was Uncle Tom's Cabin. You see, carrying forward from the 1850s, how this had a ripple effect on the people's thinking. And after all those magazine articles were gathered together in a book form, in 1852, there was such a huge demand for this one book that there were 8 printing presses that were running constantly to keep pace for the demand of this book. So let's kind of flash forward to after the Second World War. You think of the amazing book by Rachel Carson, Silent Spring. It brought to our attention the harmful effects of pesticides and other chemicals on the environment. The book inspired the grassroots environmental movement and led to the passage of the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. It's a great example of how, think of during the late 50s and during the 60s, what was on the public's mind? It was the war in Vietnam, the domino theory, communism. We have to do whatever we can to fight communism. But this book comes along and it displaces another urgent concern, saying, hey, what about our planet, right? It became an entire social movement that carries forward today. This was one of the important milestones, was that book. People like Silent Spring, people knew, oh yeah, maybe I've not read the book, but I know what that's about. I know what that issue is. I want to point to a couple of other examples. The other great historical example was Ida B. Wells. So one of the critical things in writing for social change is this idea that we have to show but not tell, either about the problem or the solution. So if I tell you, hey, go to Gino's, it's the best Italian restaurant in town, you might believe me. But if I show you and like create an image in your mind of what the pizza is like and what the smell of the garlic when you walk in, how you're greeted, how you're treated as a celebrity when you walk into the restaurant, that's like showing it. So Ida B. Wells, to her credit, showed both how people were lying about why Blacks were lynched in the South, but she described it in such a detail that people were outraged at the injustice. So she showed the truth of violence against Blacks in the 1890s. And she wasn't the only journalist during that muckraking era. We had Ida Tarbell, we had Jacob Riis, we had Sinclair Lewis, each one in their own way, really push an issue into the public's mind. Look, the water you're drinking isn't safe. The food you're eating is making you sick, right? All of these things became in the public's mind a result of journalists, novelists, artists, communicators challenging the status quo and communicating in a new way that really captured the attention of the public. So there's a couple of contemporary examples I want to point to. So recently, you might have heard of the column that New York Times columnist Nick Kristof wrote about taking on the porn industry. So he had a really unique angle on this, really talking about how women were exploited without their knowledge. And that had a way to get beyond, from the Christian community, we always think of the sinful nature of porn, but he had a really interesting take on it that was really got people to rethink and actually motivated some change. Journalist friend of mine by the name of Marshall Allen, he has his single issue has been developing a strategy for fighting high medical costs. He's now teaching journalism, particularly investigative journalism, showing how just the everyday citizen has the right and the duty almost to question out of control medical costs. And if you get an itemized medical bill, you can go back and challenge it, right? So there's also some new brands out there. So maybe you've heard of ProPublica or watched a Frontline on PBS. But one I've had contact with, two of them actually, Report for America and the Ground Truth Project. They do some really great work of investigative journalists working to expose across the nation wrongdoing, particularly like at that local level. Another one would be the Royce Report. They specialize in reporting on abuse within the charitable community, especially with evangelical churches. So another really important point I want to emphasize is that writing for social change is not just about the problems. So we as journalists, we need to root around and uncover the emerging innovators who are taking on the toughest challenges, and they're entering the thickest of the fight. These people who are the early adopters, who are inventing new ministry models. Well, writing for social change is actually a very powerful tool. It's important to recognize that it's not a panacea. Writing alone can't solve some of these complex social problems that bring about systematic change, but it becomes a crucial part of the broader effort that leverages positive change, right? So we know when we're leveraging change, we're like scaling it up. We want to see change kind of migrate and become viral. So one of the key effective ways to write about change is we have to spend more time really understanding our audience as deeply as possible, understanding who you're writing for, what are their beliefs, what are their values and experiences, how can I help you tailor your message in a way that's more likely to resonate with them. So even like in the evangelical community, we have diehard Calvinists, we have Arminians, we have people who are on the charismatic side, others are traditional Pentecostalists, some are Presbyterians, others are Methodists, some are in the main line, some are in mega churches. So we have to figure out more clearly who is that core person we're trying to reach. So if you're writing about climate change, you might write about the theology of climate. You might write about creation, and from a point of view of scripture. You also might write about the economic impact of climate change rather than some other area. So really figure out if your audience is concerned about the morality, the theology, or the financial, what is it that they're most concerned about? So the next point would be effective writing for social change is so clear about the core message, and it's delivered in language that is not technical. It uses simple words, uses metaphors, uses narrative to make this accessible to a broad audience. So if you're communicating to an audience of PhD scholars, obviously you're going to deliver the message in a way that's different. But some of the same values are at stake. But if we're trying to be able to communicate to people who are new to the issue, they don't understand it, and they're concerned about the pocketbook or concerned about what Scripture has to say, you have to more deliberately try to clarify and be concise in your language, so that it's not difficult for the readers to follow. So another point would be being passionate and authentic in your writing. So we know that people are moved by writing that's personal, reflective. We should use our own experiences and emotions, and realize that joy and anger have their purpose. We can be both joyful, but there's times when we can get angry when we see injustice committed against someone. So when we are crafting the communication that we're working on, we have to be strategic in writing for social change. Consider the impact that you're writing, what it is that you want your writing to accomplish. What's the impact? And so I'm going to leave you with this question. Do you know what would happen if journalism was done right? When journalism is done right, people make informed choices. I love this concept of the virtuous virus versus the deadly virus. Positive social change, it can and could be contagious. We've seen that happen. It can happen again, but one of the critical things is we have to be willing to change ourselves. The right words in the right time and place transform us first. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Can I share your email address in our chat panel?
Yes, please do.
All right, so I'll put that there. I just, anyone, if you have questions, please feel free to post them in the chat panel. I'm just going to ask you a few questions and follow up until we get a few others here. Our audience here is mostly people who are involved in communicating for mission agencies, and some of them are telling stories of what God is doing today around the world. What do you think? Let me find my question here. How do you think that mission communicators can think about their job as more than just kind of getting people to give to their organization or get involved? But how can missions communicators be a part of writing for social change?
Yeah, thank you. I think they absolutely can. And I think one of the important ways that we are crafting our communication, shaping our messages, really is in such a way that the message that we're delivering has a component of it that can be shared. And the best way to do that is embedding the message in a story, right? Jesus himself was so incredibly good. I often, when I'm talking with like non-believers, and we start talking about religion, and they say, well, do you know the story of the prodigal son? Do you know the story of the Good Samaritan? Everybody likes the story about the Good Samaritan. That's such a great example of how the sharing of stories not only has an impact on the individual, but we don't get that what we're going for. Yes, we do want them to be involved. We do want them to donate. We do want, whether it's time, talent, or treasure, but we actually want them to share that story, right? And those stories like stay in our head, right? So I'll just tell a little funny example. When I'm speaking in churches, I will sometimes share stories about the trips I've made to Rwanda. I've been to Rwanda 4 times, and traveled in other parts of Africa as well. But there's some great examples of not during the genocide, there are great examples there, but after the genocide, how people began to experience mercy and justice. And I've shared a couple of examples. So I did that at a church I was at probably like 10 years ago. And I happened to revisit that church. And someone came up to me after the service and said, that story of what you told about the woman whose son was killed and how she forgave the killer, I will always remember that. It's incredible. So it's like stories can be so powerful if we choose them and use them wisely.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. And I was also just really taken with how you were talking about how our media can shape our reality. And I know our missions communicators are a small part, but still a part of participating and shaping that reality, especially around God's mission. Yeah, anything else that you have to share just on just the part that media or missions communicators can play in that sphere?
Yeah, well, one thing I would encourage people to do, there's a new book out called The Evangelical Imagination that's
Mhm.
really excellent at the conceptual level. It's written by an English professor who was at Liberty, Karen Swallow Pryor. And I highly recommend it because it helps us understand how these ideas about missions become very powerful for people, and mission narratives carry forward from generation to generation. And unless we understand how those function when we're communicating, we're missing an important component of why we're communicating. And so one of the things that I point to would be what I call sacrificial love.
Mm.
So when we as writers, communicators can demonstrate and show sacrificial love to a stranger or a neighbor who's a stranger or somebody in some other situation, people connect with that message in a very powerful way. And so one of the things I would say to people is that, yeah, I know you still have to do those fundraising letters, right? And you still have to do your in-house publications about your budget or whatever you have to do. But if somehow you can integrate a narrative or a message about the power of sacrificial love, people are absolutely going to connect with that, because it's somehow the situation that we find ourselves in is that I believe that God calls us to sacrificially love someone we don't know and may never meet. And it's a stranger we don't even know exists. So the other illustration I talk to when I'm training journalists, I say, your article might be read by a parent, but the beneficiary will be the child.
Mm.
Will never read the article, never know your name, never know whether you are an award-winning journalist or just an everyday journalist, but they will have benefited from what you've written as a result of your influence on the person who read your article, the parent.
Mm. Yeah, that's
Once you
great.
realize that.
Yep. Yep. That's really good. Anything else? We don't have any questions in our chat panel. Any last thoughts that you want to share?
No, I just feel that the 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 purpose of using writing for social change requires a lot of effort. It requires us to really think through the perceptions of our audience.
Hmm.
And if you really figure out what moves someone you get to the concept I love, which is metanoia. We all know what paranoia is. Metanoia is changing somebody's mind. If you change somebody's mind, you're going to change their behavior. And if you can change the minds of millions and change the behavior of millions, you are writing for social change.
We did have one question come in from Donna. She says, how do you deal with information toxification?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. I think that we definitely need to continue using digital technology to communicate, but we have to show models to people of how people are managing their information. So it's the modeling. Say, hey, you know, I take a media fast every Sunday. It's like I don't look at TV, don't do radio, or maybe it's Saturday. So it's things that are caught, not taught. So if we're like trying to teach people, you know, like my iPhone tells me how many hours I'm online every day. I know it, but I don't know what to do about it. So I need models. So modeling becomes a very powerful tool by which we can discipline ourselves to cut down on the constant barrage of media that we're getting and information all the time. And you know, I have my phone, it's got so many notifications. Like, do I really need to know that? Maybe I should go back and turn off 90% of my notifications. So it's like mindfulness about it. That becomes a critical thing. And talking about mindfulness, here's what I do, right? Maybe you should be like, do this and you'll benefit. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. I think that's all we have. So I think we can go ahead and start our closing slides here.